Why did my teacher call CPS when I missed school for chemotherapy? The attendance office called my mom's cell while I was getting my port flushed at the oncology clinic, and I could hear Mrs. Kowalski's voice through the speaker asking why I'd missed 3 days without proper documentation. Mom's hand tightened around the phone as she explained for the 4th time this month that I had leukemia and was undergoing treatment at Children's Hospital. Mrs. Kowalski's response came back clipped and bureaucratic, saying that chronic illness required specific paperwork filed in advance and my absences were being marked as unexcused truancies. The nurse accessing my port paused when she heard Mom's voice rising, and I watched her exchange a look with the other staff member in the room. Mom ended the call by promising to bring documentation tomorrow, her face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. I told her it was fine, that I'd catch up on the work like I always did, but the tightness around her mouth told me this was becoming a bigger problem than either of us wanted to admit. Mr. Garrison taught my AP biology class and had been my favorite teacher since freshman year when he'd spent extra time helping me understand cellular respiration. He'd written recommendation letters for summer programs and told me I had real potential for medical research. When I came back to school after my diagnosis in September, he'd pulled me aside and promised to help me stay on track with the curriculum despite my treatment schedule. For the first month, he'd been true to his word, sending me notes and letting me make up labs on Saturdays when I felt strong enough. But something shifted in October after I missed the midterm due to a particularly brutal round of chemotherapy that left me hospitalized for 5 days with complications. He'd marked the exam as a 0 despite my doctor's note, saying makeup exams created unfair advantages for other students. When I'd tried to explain that I hadn't chosen to be in the hospital fighting an infection, his expression had gone cold in a way I'd never seen before. The pattern started small enough that I almost didn't notice it at first. Mr. Garrison began calling on me in class when I was obviously struggling, my hand not even raised, asking complex questions about material we'd covered during my absences. When I'd stumble through an answer or admit I wasn't sure, he'd make comments about students needing to take responsibility for their own learning, regardless of circumstances. Other kids would shift uncomfortably in their seats, and my friend Jasmine started whispering answers to me when she could. But the real problem was the attendance tracking. Every absence, even ones covered by hospital documentation, went into his gradebook as a participation 0. My A from last semester had dropped to a C by mid-November, and my guidance counselor said if it fell any lower, I'd lose my eligibility for the National Honor Society and potentially my college scholarship applications. Mom had meetings with the principal, brought stacks of medical records, and followed every protocol the school required. Nothing changed Mr. Garrison's grading policy. The day everything exploded started like any other treatment day. I'd gone to the hospital at 6 in the morning for blood work and chemotherapy infusion, a process that would take roughly 4 hours if everything went smoothly. Mom had called the school attendance line at 7:30, left a detailed message about my appointment, and forwarded the hospital scheduling confirmation to the attendance office email. By noon, I was done with treatment and feeling relatively okay, so Mom drove me to school for afternoon classes. I walked into AP biology 20 minutes late with my medical excuse note, still wearing the hospital bracelet they'd forgotten to cut off my wrist. Mr. Garrison looked up from his lecture on genetic mutations, and his face went through several expressions before settling on something between anger and disgust. He told me to take my seat but added that coming to school after medical appointments showed poor judgment about infection risk and put other students in danger. The comment hung in the air like poison gas, and I felt 30 pairs of eyes on me as I slid into my chair. After class, Mr. Garrison asked me to stay behind while other students filed out. Jasmine hesitated by the door until I nodded that I'd be fine, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Once we were alone, he closed the door and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't read. He said he was concerned about my attendance pattern and whether home circumstances might be contributing to my excessive absences. The words didn't make sense at first because he knew about my leukemia, had seen the documentation, had been in the same meeting with my mom and the principal. I explained again about chemotherapy schedules and how the timing wasn't something I could control. Mr. Garrison crossed his arms and said that many families used medical issues as excuses to avoid school requirements, and he'd seen patterns of educational neglect before. His voice had that careful tone people use when they're accusing you of something without saying it directly. I felt my face getting hot as I realized he was suggesting my mom was lying about my treatment or keeping me home unnecessarily. I pulled up my shirt sleeve to show him the portacath scar on my chest where they accessed my veins for chemotherapy, a raised line of tissue that would probably never fully fade. I showed him the hospital bracelet still on my wrist with that day's date and my patient ID number. I asked him what possible reason my mom would have to invent a cancer diagnosis and subject me to months of poisonous treatment that made my hair fall out and my body ache. Mr. Garrison's expression didn't change as he said medical procedures could be elective, and some parents had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where they invented illnesses for attention. The accusation was so absurd and cruel that I actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that surprised both of us. He told me his concerns were serious and he had a duty to report suspected educational neglect to Child Protective Services. I asked him if he was joking, and he said he'd already filed the report that morning before I'd even arrived at school. The room tilted sideways, and I grabbed the desk to steady myself. Mom's phone rang at 2:15 while she was at work, and the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with our county's area code. The woman on the line identified herself as Veronica Chen from Child Protective Services and said they'd received a report alleging educational neglect and possible medical abuse. Mom's voice went very quiet as she asked what the report specifically claimed, and I watched her face drain of color as she listened to the response. The allegations stated that I was being kept home from school excessively under the guise of medical treatment, that my mother was possibly fabricating or exaggerating health issues for attention or financial gain through disability benefits, and that my educational needs were being neglected in favor of unnecessary medical interventions. Mom's hand started shaking as she explained about my leukemia diagnosis, my oncologist's name, my treatment protocol at Children's Hospital. Veronica said she understood Mom wanted to provide context, but CPS had to investigate all reports thoroughly, and an investigator would be visiting our home within 48 hours. The investigation consumed our lives like a second cancer. A woman named Dorothy Klein showed up at our apartment on a Friday evening with a clipboard and a measured smile that never reached her eyes. She walked through our small two-bedroom place, taking notes on everything from the contents of our refrigerator to the medications in our bathroom cabinet. She photographed my pill organizers and the anti-nausea medication I took to handle chemotherapy side effects. She asked to see my room, and I watched her examine my schoolwork, my books, the medical supplies I kept by my bed for managing port care. Dorothy's questions came in careful succession, designed to sound casual, but clearly following a script. Did my mom ever seem overly focused on my medical issues? Had I ever felt pressured to seem sicker than I was? Did doctors ever express concern about my mom's requests for treatments? Each question felt like an attack disguised as concern, and I struggled to answer without sounding defensive because defensive people looked guilty. Dorothy wanted to interview me alone, and Mom had to wait in the kitchen while we talked in my room. The woman's pen moved constantly across her notepad as I explained my diagnosis, my treatment schedule, the side effects I experienced from chemotherapy. She asked why I went to so many appointments if the cancer was being treated successfully, and I had to explain that chemotherapy happened in cycles over months, not in a single session. She asked why I needed so many different medications when cancer typically required just one treatment. I listed out the anti-nausea drugs, the antibiotics to prevent infection, the pain medication for bone marrow biopsy recovery, the antifungal medication, because chemo destroyed my immune system. Dorothy made a small humming sound that suggested skepticism, and I felt panic rising in my chest. This woman had the power to decide whether my family stayed together or got torn apart based on lies told by a teacher who apparently couldn't accept that 6 students deserved accommodations. The school meeting happened the following Monday with my mom, me, Principal Hayworth, Mr. Garrison, the guidance counselor, and the district's legal representative, all crammed into a small conference room. Principal Hayworth opened by saying they took all allegations seriously, but also needed to support students with documented medical needs. Mr. Garrison immediately jumped in with a prepared statement about his concerns regarding my attendance pattern and what he perceived as enablement of school avoidance. He pulled up a spreadsheet showing every absence I'd had since September, color-coded by type, with notes about which ones he considered legitimate versus questionable. The fact that he'd been tracking this so meticulously, building a case against a 16-year-old cancer patient, made my stomach turn. Mom presented our counter-evidence, a folder thick with hospital records, treatment schedules, doctor's notes, medication lists. The legal representative suggested that perhaps a medical evaluation by the school's physician could provide clarity, and I wanted to scream that I'd been evaluated by actual oncologists who specialized in childhood leukemia. Mr. Garrison brought up my AP biology grade, using it as evidence that I wasn't keeping up academically, which he suggested indicated either lack of effort or cognitive issues that should be investigated. The guidance counselor pointed out that my other grades remained strong, A's in English and history, B's in math and Spanish. Mr. Garrison countered that those teachers were being too lenient out of sympathy, essentially enabling my failure to meet proper academic standards. His argument kept circling back to the idea that accommodating my medical needs was actually harming my education and future prospects. The twisted logic made my head hurt. I was failing his class specifically because he refused to accommodate my absences for chemotherapy, and now he was using that failure as proof that I needed to be in school more consistently, which I couldn't do because of the chemotherapy that was keeping me alive. Principal Hayworth suggested we table the discussion until after CPS completed their investigation, and Mr. Garrison's satisfied expression told me he considered that a victory. Dorothy made 2 more home visits over the next 3 weeks, each one more invasive than the last. She interviewed my younger brother about whether he felt neglected because of my medical issues. She requested permission to speak with my oncologist, and Dr. Patel spent 40 minutes on the phone explaining acute lymphoblastic leukemia, chemotherapy protocols, expected side effects, and prognosis. Dorothy took notes, but her questions suggested she was looking for inconsistencies or red flags rather than trying to understand my actual medical situation. She asked Dr. Patel whether parents ever pressured for more aggressive treatment than necessary, and I could hear my doctor's confusion through the phone as she explained that no parent wants their child to undergo chemotherapy unless absolutely necessary, because the treatment itself was brutal and dangerous. Dorothy requested copies of all my medical records dating back to my diagnosis, and the hospital compliance officer had to get involved to determine what could be legally released. Our lives became an open book for scrutiny by people who seemed determined to find problems that didn't exist. The worst part was watching my mom fracture under the pressure. She'd taken unpaid leave from her job as a dental hygienist to attend CPS meetings and school conferences. She'd spent hours organizing documentation and writing timeline summaries of my medical care. She'd stopped sleeping properly because the investigation kept her up at night worrying about worst-case scenarios. One evening, I found her crying in the kitchen, surrounded by medical bills and bank statements that CPS had requested to prove we weren't profiting financially from disability benefits. The cruelty of forcing a mother fighting to save her child's life to also prove she wasn't a fraud became overwhelming. I hugged her and promised everything would be okay, but neither of us believed it. The system that was supposed to protect children was actively harming our family based on one teacher's vindictive misunderstanding of medical necessity. Jasmine and other classmates started a petition asking the school board to review Mr. Garrison's accommodation policies for students with serious illnesses. Over 200 students signed within 3 days, and several parents called the principal's office expressing concern about how my situation had been handled. Mr. Garrison responded by adding a unit to his curriculum about scientific skepticism and the importance of questioning medical authority, complete with case studies of parents who'd harmed children through unnecessary medical intervention. The timing wasn't subtle. He was using his classroom to justify his actions, teaching students that my situation might be an example of medical abuse rather than legitimate illness. Kids who'd signed the petition found their class participation grades mysteriously dropping. The administration claimed they couldn't interfere with the teachers' pedagogical choices, even when those choices were clearly retaliatory against students who'd supported me. The CPS investigation dragged into December, and Dorothy scheduled what she called a closing interview at their downtown office. Mom and I sat in a gray waiting room with fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and institutional. When Dorothy finally called us back, she had another woman with her, identified as her supervisor, Catherine Merritt. They went through their findings methodically, and I felt my chest getting tighter with each point. They'd confirmed my medical diagnosis was legitimate and treatment was appropriate. They'd found no evidence of financial exploitation or Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They'd verified that my educational needs were being met, despite my absences through homebound instruction and makeup work. Everything they said should have been clearing us, but Dorothy's tone remained neutral and careful. Then came the pivot point, where Catherine explained that while the specific allegations weren't substantiated, they'd identified concerns about educational planning that needed monitoring. The monitoring plan meant CPS would keep our case open for 6 months, with monthly check-ins to ensure I was maintaining academic progress and attending school whenever medically possible. It meant continued invasion of our privacy and continued stress on my mom, who was already stretched beyond her limits. It meant the system had found a way to not admit they'd wasted resources investigating a malicious report while still justifying their involvement in our lives. Mom asked what would happen if we refused the monitoring, and Catherine's response made it clear that refusal would be interpreted as lack of cooperation and could trigger a more formal investigation. We were trapped in a bureaucratic maze with no exit because one teacher had decided that his interpretation of attendance policies mattered more than a student's survival through cancer treatment. Back at school, the tension in AP biology became unbearable. Mr. Garrison maintained professional courtesy in a way that somehow felt more hostile than open conflict. He called on me frequently, assigned me extra homework to make up for absences, and graded my work with standards that seemed more rigorous than what he applied to other students. When I earned a B on a lab report, he returned it covered in red ink, questioning my methodology and conclusions that matched the rubric he'd provided. Other teachers noticed what was happening, and my English teacher, Ms. Delacroix, pulled me aside to say she'd filed a complaint with the teachers' union about Mr. Garrison's conduct. But the union representative said grading decisions and accommodation judgments fell under teacher discretion unless clear discrimination could be proven. My word against his wasn't enough, and my declining grade became evidence supporting his position that I needed to be in school more regardless of medical circumstances. Mom hired an education attorney named Samuel Ortega, who specialized in disability rights and 504 plan violations. Our first meeting lasted 2 hours as we walked through everything that had happened since my diagnosis. Samuel's face darkened as I described Mr. Garrison's comments about medical abuse and his decision to report us to CPS without consulting the school nurse or my oncologist. He explained that students with serious health conditions were protected under federal law requiring reasonable accommodations, and refusing to allow makeup work for documented medical absences violated those protections. He drafted a formal complaint to the school district outlining multiple violations of my civil rights and demanding immediate intervention. The letter was 8 pages long, cited specific statutes and case law, and requested compensation for the emotional distress caused by the district's failure to properly train and supervise staff regarding students with disabilities. Sending that letter felt like finally fighting back after months of just trying to survive. The district's response came from their general counsel, a terse letter acknowledging receipt of our complaint and stating that all personnel matters were handled confidentially and we wouldn't be informed of any disciplinary actions taken. Samuel called it a classic stonewalling tactic designed to frustrate families into giving up. He filed a formal complaint with the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, a process that could take months but created a permanent federal record of the district's violations. He also reached out to local media, and a reporter named Yasmin Khalid contacted us about doing a story on how schools handle students with serious illnesses. Mom was hesitant about going public, worried it would make things worse, but I'd reached a point where I didn't care anymore. If my experience could prevent this from happening to another sick kid, then the exposure was worth it. Yasmin's story ran on the local news website with the headline, "Student with Leukemia Reported to CPS by Teacher Over Treatment Absences." The article included my medical timeline, quotes from my oncologist about the necessity of my treatment schedule, and comments from education law experts saying the school had clearly violated federal disability protections. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story got shared thousands of times on social media. Parents flooded the school board meetings demanding accountability, and the State Teachers Association issued a statement condemning the reporting of medically necessary absences to CPS. Suddenly, our private nightmare was public, and while the attention was uncomfortable, it also meant we weren't alone anymore. Other families reached out sharing similar stories of schools treating sick children as problems to be managed rather than students to be supported. The pattern was bigger than just Mr. Garrison or just our district. The school board called an emergency meeting and voted to place Mr. Garrison on administrative leave pending an investigation into his conduct. The district also announced they'd be reviewing all attendance and accommodation policies to ensure compliance with federal disability law. Principal Hayworth released a statement saying the school was committed to supporting all students, regardless of medical circumstances, though he didn't mention how they'd failed to support me for months, despite repeated complaints. CPS closed our case officially, with Catherine sending a terse letter stating that after review, no further monitoring was necessary. Dorothy never apologized for the investigation or acknowledged how the process had harmed our family. Samuel said that was typical of bureaucracies that would rather quietly close cases than admit wrongdoing that could create liability. The hardest part wasn't the investigation or the publicity or even Mr. Garrison's retaliation. It was the realization that systems designed to protect children had been weaponized against me because I was sick in ways that inconvenienced institutional priorities. That teachers I'd trusted could view my cancer not as a challenge to help me overcome, but as a disruption to their attendance statistics and grade curves. That CPS, an agency meant to rescue children from abuse, could become an instrument of abuse itself when wielded by vindictive adults against families already fighting for survival. The betrayal cut deeper than any chemotherapy side effect because it came from people who were supposed to care about my well-being but only cared about their rules and procedures. Every adult who'd questioned whether my cancer was real, whether my mom was exploiting me, whether I deserved accommodations for trying not to die, had revealed something ugly about how society treats sick children when they become inconvenient. My treatment protocol ended in March after 7 months of chemotherapy cycles that had destroyed the leukemia cells, but also destroyed my sense that the world was fundamentally fair. I'd lost my hair twice, spent weeks in the hospital with infections, missed my entire junior year homecoming and winter formal, and graduated from Mr. Garrison's AP biology class with a C that would sit on my transcript forever as proof of his cruelty. Dr. Patel said my scans looked clear, and my blood work showed normal cell counts. I was in remission, a word that meant victory, but also meant uncertainty, because cancer could always come back. The hospital threw me a party with sugar-free cake and sparkling cider, and my nurses gave me a blanket they'd all signed with encouraging messages. But I couldn't fully celebrate, because I'd learned that survival wasn't just about beating cancer. It was about surviving the institutions and people who saw your illness as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. The school board's investigation concluded in April with findings that Mr. Garrison had violated district accommodation policies and shown bias against students with disabilities. They offered him the choice between resignation or termination, and he chose resignation effective at the end of the school year. No criminal charges were filed, no teaching license was revoked, no formal apology was issued to our family. He just moved on to a teaching position in another district, where presumably he could continue imposing rigid attendance policies on students who didn't fit his definition of acceptable reasons for absence. Principal Hayworth retired early citing health issues, though rumors suggested the school board had pushed him out for his mishandling of my case. The district implemented new training for all staff about disability accommodations and medical absences, mandatory sessions that wouldn't have been necessary if they'd followed existing federal law in the first place. Our suffering had become their lesson plan. Samuel negotiated a settlement with the district that included monetary compensation for emotional distress, removal of the C from my transcript, and replacement with a medical withdrawal notation, and guaranteed accommodations for any future medical needs. The money helped with the medical bills that insurance hadn't covered, but no amount could compensate for the trauma of being investigated by CPS while fighting cancer. Mom used part of the settlement to take us on a vacation to the beach once I was strong enough to travel. We spent a week doing nothing but sitting in the sand and watching waves, not talking about school or investigations or cancer, just existing together without crisis. My hair was growing back in soft patches, and the port scar on my chest was fading to a thin white line. I looked like I was healing on the outside, but the inside damage would take longer to repair. Senior year started with a new AP biology teacher who'd been briefed on my medical history and bent over backward to assure me I'd be supported through any absences. The accommodation felt strange after a year of fighting for basic human decency. My grades climbed back to A's across all subjects, and colleges started sending acceptance letters with scholarship offers. I wrote my admissions essay about resilience and advocacy, about learning to fight systems that claim to help, but actually harm. Several schools specifically mentioned how powerful my story was and how they wanted students who could challenge injustice. The irony wasn't lost on me that Mr. Garrison's cruelty had ultimately strengthened my college applications by giving me material about overcoming adversity. But I'd have traded every acceptance letter to have never gone through that nightmare year in the first place. Mom and I testified at a state legislative hearing about a proposed bill requiring CPS to consult with treating physicians before investigating medical neglect allegations related to chronic illness. Our testimony described the reality of fighting cancer, while also fighting the social services system that should have been supporting us. The committee room was packed with other families, sharing similar stories of schools reporting them for medical absences, of CPS investigations triggered by teachers who didn't understand complex health conditions. The bill passed unanimously and was signed into law with provisions requiring training for mandatory reporters about distinguishing between medical neglect and appropriate treatment for serious illness. One representative told us privately that our case had been the catalyst for legislative action that should have happened years ago. We'd become symbols of systemic failure and change, roles we'd never wanted but couldn't escape. I graduated high school with honors and multiple scholarship offers, accepted admission to a university with a strong pre-med program. My plan was to become a pediatric oncologist, so I could help other sick kids navigate not just their illness, but the systems and institutions that failed to protect them. Dr. Patel wrote one of my recommendation letters, describing me as a patient who'd shown remarkable strength not just in fighting cancer, but in fighting for the right to be treated with dignity during treatment. She mentioned our case in medical conferences as an example of how schools sometimes traumatize already vulnerable students through ignorance and rigid adherence to policies that ignore medical reality. Mr. Garrison's name never came up in those discussions, but the pattern he represented, teachers who viewed accommodations as unfair advantages rather than civil rights, remained unfortunately common. 3 years later, I was thriving in college, maintaining a strong GPA in challenging science courses, and volunteering at the children's hospital where I'd been treated. My cancer remained in remission, the regular scans showing clear results that let me exhale each time. Mom had rebuilt her career and her emotional stability, though she still carried the trauma of that investigation year in the way her shoulders tensed when school officials called. We'd both learned that survival wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of carrying what happened forward into whatever came next. The port scar on my chest was completely faded now, barely visible, but the emotional scars from being investigated for the crime of being sick stayed fresh. Some wounds heal on the outside while staying raw underneath, and that's the part they don't tell you about surviving cancer and surviving the cruelty of people who should have protected you, but chose bureaucracy over humanity instead.